The morning sun had barely begun to rise over Seoul when Haedong Royal Neuroscience Hospital came alive. The hospital overlooked the Han River, its towering glass walls glowing with soft golden light. Inside, polished marble floors reflected the quiet footsteps of nurses, beginning another 12-hour shift. Executive patients occupied luxurious private suites, while some of the country's finest neurologists prepared for another demanding day. Standing near the nursing station was Adana Okoye. At 27, she had traveled thousands of miles from Nigeria after earning one of the world's most competitive neurological nursing fellowships. Her navy blue uniform was perfectly pressed, her identification badge neatly clipped to her pocket, and her long natural curls were tucked beneath a crisp nursing cap. She smiled warmly as she greeted the morning team. "Good morning, everyone." Several nurses returned the greeting politely. Others simply nodded before continuing their conversations. Senior charge nurse Han Siren approached with a clipboard. "You'll be assigned to the Executive Neurological Intensive Care Unit." Adana accepted the schedule with gratitude. "Thank you." As she walked toward the medication room, two younger nurses exchanged amused glances. One quietly repeated her greeting, exaggerating her Nigerian accent. "Good morning, everyone." The other covered her mouth to hide a laugh. A third joined them. I wonder if patients even understand her. Their laughter remained soft enough that they believed she couldn't hear. But she did. Every word. She paused only briefly before continuing down the hallway. Years of studying and working overseas had taught her something important. Not every insult deserved a response. Sometimes dignity answered more loudly than anger ever could. Her first patient that morning was an elderly woman recovering from brain surgery. The woman appeared frightened. Adana gently adjusted her blanket. "Good morning, Mrs. Choi.
I'm Adana.
I'll be taking care of you today." The woman's nervous expression softened immediately. "Thank you." Throughout the morning, Adana moved from room to room with remarkable patience. She explained every medication before administering it. She answered every question carefully. She never hurried through conversations. Even when patients struggled to speak, she listened without interruption. Nurse Han observed quietly from across the corridor. "She certainly talks a lot," one nurse whispered. "Especially for someone so new." Another laughed. "Maybe that's why her patients like her." The comments continued throughout the shift. Yet Adana never acknowledged them. She simply continued caring for people. By late afternoon, she entered another patient room. An elderly man recovering from a stroke seemed unusually anxious. She noticed an old photograph resting on his bedside table. "You have beautiful grandchildren," she said. His eyes brightened. He spent the next several minutes telling her stories about them. When she finally left the room, his blood pressure had settled considerably. Watching from the doorway, Dr. Min Suyen smiled. "Remarkable." A nearby nurse shrugged. "She's just friendly."
No, Dr. Min answered quietly.
"She's making frightened people feel safe." There's a difference. Room 1701 occupied the most secure floor of the hospital. Luxury security doors guarded the Executive Neurological Intensive Care Suite. Former intelligence officers stood quietly outside. Inside, Kang Jae-won remained completely still. Several weeks earlier, he had undergone emergency brain surgery after surviving an assassination attempt. Since then, the country's leading neurological specialists had monitored his condition around the clock. His brain activity remained stable. His heart remained strong. Yet he had never regained consciousness. Most nurses completed their scheduled assessments before quietly leaving the room. There seemed little else to do. Adana approached differently. She gently knocked before entering. "Good afternoon, Mr. Kang. My name is Adana. I'll be caring for you today." One of the younger nurses quietly rolled her eyes from the hallway. "He's unconscious. He can't hear you." Adana smiled politely. "Perhaps. But hearing is often the last sense to disappear." Without waiting for agreement, she continued. She checked every monitor carefully, adjusted the pillows supporting his shoulders, applied moisturizer to prevent dry skin, explained each medication before administering it. "I'm adjusting your four now. This medicine will help reduce swelling. I'm raising your bed a little." Her voice remained calm,
Steady.
respectful. Later that afternoon, She noticed several unopened letters resting inside a leather folder. Security Director Nam Jae-ho entered quietly. They're from employees. He always read every letter personally. Adana looked toward him. May I read one? Nam hesitated only briefly. I think he would have liked that. She selected the first envelope. It came from a warehouse supervisor. Chairman Kong. She read softly. 5 years ago you paid for my daughter's heart surgery. You never allowed anyone to tell us who helped. We only discovered the truth last month. She graduates from university next spring. Thank you for giving our family another future. Silence filled the room. Even Nam lowered his eyes. Adana folded the letter carefully. I think people should hear how much they're appreciated, whether awake or asleep. She continued reading. Every afternoon, every shift, every day. Nearly a week passed. Most staff considered Kong Jae-won's condition unchanged. Adana disagreed. Not dramatically, only slightly. She noticed tiny details others overlooked. His breathing occasionally synchronized with familiar voices. His fingers relaxed when spoken to calmly. His facial muscles showed subtle reactions during neurological assessments. Each observation was carefully documented.
Time.
Heart rate, brain activity, environmental conditions. Nothing was left to memory. One afternoon, she approached Nurse Han. I've noticed several small neurological responses. Han barely looked up from her paperwork. They're involuntary. Continue routine monitoring. Adana nodded respectfully. I understand, but I'd still like to document them.
Han Sai-hid.
If it makes you feel better. Later that evening, Professor Baek Dong-hyun conducted his weekly review of executive ICU patients. As he examined Kang's chart, something immediately caught his attention. Several pages contained unusually detailed nursing observations. He adjusted his glasses. Who wrote these?
Dr. Min answered.
Adana Okoye. Professor Beck continued reading. Minute-by-minute breathing changes. Responses during sensory stimulation. Changes in muscle tone. Patterns connected to conversation. Nothing was exaggerated. Everything was objective. He looked toward Adana. You've been monitoring this closely. She nodded. I don't know whether the changes are significant, but they're consistent. Professor Beck walked into the patient's room. He repeated several neurological tests, then compared them with the previous week's results. His expression became thoughtful. When he finished, he quietly addressed the ICU team. Increase observation frequency. Several nurses exchanged confused glances. One whispered, because of those notes? Professor Beck answered without raising his voice. Medicine advances because someone notices what others ignore. He turned toward Adana. Excellent work. For the first time since arriving in Seoul, several members of the nursing staff looked at her differently. Not because of her accent, not because of where she came from, but because her careful attention had earned something far more valuable: professional respect. And although none of them realized it yet, those tiny observations were the first signs that room 1701 was about to witness something no one had expected. Rain drummed softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Haedong Royal Neuroscience Hospital. By 10 o'clock that evening, the Executive Neurological Intensive Care Unit had grown unusually quiet. Visiting hours had ended. Most lights had been dimmed, leaving only the gentle glow of heart monitors and neurological displays. Adana Okoye finished checking her final patient's medication before making her way to room 1701. She knocked gently, just as she did every shift. Good evening, Mr. Kong. I'm back. The room, as always, offered no reply. She smiled anyway. I know today was busy. Professor Beck examined you twice. I think he'd be pleased with your progress. She carefully adjusted Kong Jae-won's blanket before checking his 4 lines and reviewing the monitor readings. Everything appeared stable. His heartbeat remained steady. Brain activity showed no significant changes. Still, she pulled a chair beside the bed. Some nurses spent only minutes in the executive suite. Adana always stayed a little longer. She believed healing wasn't measured only by medication. Sometimes people simply needed another human presence. She opened another letter from the leather folder Security Director Nam had entrusted to her. This one is from one of your drivers, she said softly. He says you attended his mother's funeral without telling anyone. You stood quietly in the back because you didn't want attention. She smiled. I think kindness is often strongest when nobody knows about it. Outside the room, two nurses passed by. One whispered, "She's talking to him again." The other smiled knowingly. Maybe one day he'll answer. Both laughed quietly before disappearing down the corridor. Inside the room, Adana never heard them. She had begun telling Kong stories from home. About Lagos after a summer rain. About her grandmother, who believed every patient deserved to hear hope, even when they couldn't respond. She used to tell me, Adana said gently, never speak around unconscious people as though they are absent. Speak to them as though they're simply resting. She reached forward and lightly straightened the blanket over Kang's shoulder. I've always remembered that. As she stood to leave, something caught her eye. His index finger moved.
Barely.
So slightly that someone looking away would have missed it entirely. Adana froze. She looked at the monitor. Heart rate changing. She leaned closer. Mr. Kong. His eyelids trembled. Her training immediately took over. She pressed the emergency call button. Neurology team to executive ICU. Within seconds, footsteps thundered down the hallway. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room. Professor Beck arrived moments later. Everyone surrounded the bed.
Then,
slowly, Kong Jaiwon's eyes opened. The bright ceiling lights blurred above him. His vision searched the room. It settled on one face. Adana. His lips moved weakly. The room became completely silent. His first whispered word escaped almost unnoticed. Nurse. Nobody breathed. Even the heart monitors seemed louder. Professor Beck quickly began his neurological assessment. Mr. Kong. Can you hear me? A faint nod. Another miracle. The room erupted into controlled medical activity. But for one unforgettable moment. The first person Kong Jaiwon had recognized after weeks in a coma was the nurse everyone had underestimated. Within 30 minutes, the executive floor was filled with specialists, neurologists, critical care physicians, rehabilitation consultants, hospital administrators. Every examination confirmed the same astonishing conclusion. Kong Jaiwon was awake. His neurological responses were consistent. He recognized familiar objects. He obeyed simple commands. Most importantly, his recovery exceeded every expectation. Professor Beck removed his glasses and smiled. This is extraordinary. Security Director Nam quietly stepped into the room. For weeks, he had maintained his usual calm expression. Today, emotion finally broke through. He bowed respectfully toward the hospital staff. Thank you. Several nurses stood together near the doorway. One quietly whispered, he woke up during her shift. Another added, and the first thing he said was nurse. The word spread through the hospital within hours. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others couldn't stop thinking about it. Later that afternoon, Professor Beck conducted another memory assessment. Mr. Kong. What do you remember? Jaiwon remained silent for several moments. His memory felt fragmented. Scattered pieces of darkness. Voices.
Light.
Silence. Then, one thing became clear. There was, he said slowly, a voice. Professor Beck leaned forward. What kind of voice? Calm. It kept explaining everything. It read letters. It told stories. His eyes searched the room until they rested on Adana. You. The room fell completely silent. Adana smiled warmly. I'm glad you're back. For the first time since opening his eyes, Kong smiled. It was small,
Weak.
but unmistakably genuine. Outside the room, the same nurses who had once mocked Adana's accent stood speechless. None of them knew what to say. Mid-video CTA. If you're enjoying today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Compassion often leaves the deepest mark where no one expects it. And if you love emotional Korean drama stories filled with unforgettable moments and inspiring characters, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful story. Recovery came gradually. Each day, Kong Jaiwon regained a little more strength. His speech improved. His memory sharpened. Physical therapy sessions became longer. Neurological evaluations showed remarkable progress. Yet one mystery continued fascinating Professor Beck. Jaiwan consistently remembered Adana's voice with unusual clarity. During a rehabilitation session, the professor asked, "Do you remember conversations?" "Not exactly," Jaiwan admitted. "I remember feelings." Professor Beck nodded encouragingly. "What feelings?" "I never felt alone." He paused thoughtfully. "I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But every day, someone reminded me who I was." Across the room, Adana quietly lowered her eyes. She hadn't realized those simple conversations had reached him. Professor Beck later gathered several nurses for a teaching session. "What happened here," he explained, "is supported by neurological research. Familiar voices and emotionally meaningful communication can stimulate recovering neural pathways in certain patients." He looked around the room. "We may never know exactly how much unconscious patients perceive, which is precisely why they deserve our respect." The lesson settled heavily over everyone present. After the meeting ended, Senior Charge Nurse Han approached Adana privately. For several moments, she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she bowed her head slightly. "I judged you before I knew you. I heard your accent, and assumed I knew your ability." She looked genuinely ashamed. "I'm sorry." Adana smiled gently. "We've both learned something." Han looked up. "You've been kinder to me than I deserved." Adana shook her head. "We're nurses. If we stop believing people can change, we've forgotten why we chose this profession." For the first time since Adana had arrived in Seoul, the atmosphere inside the executive ICU truly changed. Conversations became warmer. Respect replaced assumptions. And every unconscious patient, regardless of status, began receiving something many had overlooked before: a voice, a name, and the quiet reassurance that they were never alone. The atmosphere inside Haedong Royal Neuroscience Hospital was noticeably different in the weeks that followed. The same corridors that had once echoed with whispered jokes now carried genuine conversations. Nurses from different countries exchanged experiences during breaks. Junior staff asked questions instead of making assumptions. One afternoon, after finishing her rounds, Adana was organizing patient charts when she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned. Senior Charge Nurse Han Siren stood there alone. For the first time since Adana had arrived in Seoul, Han looked uncertain. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course." The two women stepped into the quiet rooftop healing garden overlooking the Han River. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Han broke the silence. "When you first came here, I convinced myself your accent meant your training wasn't as good as ours." She sighed. "I never said those words to your face. But I laughed. I stayed silent when others laughed. And silence can hurt just as much." Adana listened without interrupting. Han looked toward the skyline. "I've been a nurse for 15 years. I always believed compassion defined our profession. Then I realized I hadn't shown you any." She bowed deeply. "I'm truly sorry." Adana gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "We all carry blind spots. The important thing is whether we're willing to see them." Han looked up. "You forgave me that easily?" Adana smiled. "I came here to heal people, not collect enemies." The two women shared a quiet laugh. From that day forward, Han became one of Adana's strongest supporters. Whenever new international nurses joined the hospital, she personally welcomed them. "Everyone deserves the chance to be known before they're judged," she often reminded her team. 6 months later, Khan Jaiwan walked steadily through the rehabilitation center without assistance. His recovery amazed even the specialists who had once questioned whether he would ever regain full independence. During one follow-up appointment, Professor Beck reviewed his latest neurological scans. "I don't expect to see you back here unless you're visiting someone else." Jaiwan smiled. "I hope that's a promise." After the consultation, he invited Professor Beck and Adana to a private meeting in the hospital's executive conference suite. Architectural drawings covered the large walnut table. Digital renderings rotated across a massive presentation screen. Adana studied them curiously. "What is all this?" Jaiwan folded his hands. "When I couldn't move, I learned something. I depended entirely on people I couldn't control. Some treated me like a responsibility. One treated me like a human being. He looked directly at Adana. I don't want that lesson to end with me. He revealed the final blueprint. The Kong Jaiwan International Compassion Fellowship for Critical Care Nurses. The program would provide fully funded specialist training for exceptional nurses from underrepresented communities across the world. Applicants would be selected anonymously. No names.
No photographs. No nationality.
Only skill. Only character. Adana looked up. You've thought about this for a long time. He nodded. I had weeks to think. I'd like you to help build it. She remained silent for several moments. Finally, she smiled. I'll accept, but only if every nurse who earns a place knows they were chosen because of merit. Jaiwan extended his hand. That was always the plan. The fellowship launched the following spring. Applications arrived from every continent. Young nurses traveled to Seoul carrying dreams, determination, and stories of overcoming obstacles. Haedong Royal Neuroscience Hospital slowly became known for something greater than advanced neurosurgery. It became known for its culture. Professor Beck introduced a new neurological care guideline. Every unconscious patient would now be addressed by name. Every procedure would be explained aloud. Every nurse would spend a few quiet moments speaking with patients, not because recovery was guaranteed, but because dignity never depended on consciousness. Medical journals praised the initiative. International hospitals requested copies of the protocol. One afternoon, Adana stood before a classroom filled with new fellowship nurses. She held up a simple patient chart. Never forget, the person in the bed is still a person. They may not answer. They may never remember your face, but your kindness is never wasted. The room remained completely silent. Every student wrote those words down. Among the audience sat Han Siren. She smiled proudly. Months earlier, she had underestimated the woman standing before the room.
Now.
She couldn't imagine a better teacher. Almost 1 year after awakening from his coma, Kong Jaiwan returned to the rooftop healing garden where so much had changed. The Seoul skyline shimmered beneath the evening sun. Patients walked peaceful garden paths with therapists. Families laughed together. The hospital felt warmer than ever before. Adana stepped onto the terrace carrying 2 cups of tea. I thought you might be here. I've become predictable. She smiled. Only a little. They sat quietly, overlooking the Han River. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Jaiwan broke the silence. People keep asking me what I remember from the coma. And what do you tell them? The truth. I don't remember every day. I don't remember every face. But I remember never feeling abandoned. He looked toward her. There was always a voice. It reminded me where I was. It reminded me that tomorrow was worth reaching. Adana lowered her eyes for a moment. My grandmother used to say something. What was that? Hope travels farther than fear when someone is willing to carry it. Jaiwan smiled. I think she was right. Below them, a group of newly arrived international nurses toured the hospital with Han Siren. Their laughter echoed through the courtyard. Different accents blended together. No one mocked them. Instead, they asked each other questions, shared stories, learned from one another. The fellowship had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Lives were changing, not only because medicine was advancing, but because compassion had become part of excellence. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the Seoul skyline, the camera pulled back from the glass facade of Haedong Royal Neuroscience Hospital. Inside those walls, patients continued receiving world-class treatment. But they also received something impossible to measure with machines: respect, kindness, human connection. And somewhere in the executive ICU, a newly hired nurse gently introduced herself to an unconscious patient before beginning her shift. Because one woman had refused to believe that silence meant no one was listening. The voice that others had mocked had become the voice that transformed an entire hospital and reminded everyone that true healing begins long before the eyes ever open.